The envelope was thick, creamy, and elegant, the kind chosen to make a statement. It arrived on a Tuesday morning, tucked between the electric bill and a flyer for carpet cleaning. Laura, 62, turned it over in her hands before slicing the seal with a letter opener she hadn't used in years. Inside was a gold-foiled invitation. Please join us in celebrating the engagement of Ethan Holloway and Emily James. The script was delicate, sophisticated. Below that, her ex-husband's name Richard Holloway and his wife's name, Susan Holloway, were listed as hosts. Not Ethan's parents. Not the Holloway family. Just Richard and Susan. Laura read it again, then finally set it down on the kitchen counter with fingers that trembled more than she cared to admit. My 7. The last time she'd seen Ethan was 4 months ago, a rushed lunch between his business trips. He talked about a woman named Emily. Laura had smiled, asked the right questions, taken mental notes so she could remember Emily's favorite flower and her love of spicy chai. He hadn't mentioned a party. And he certainly hadn't mentioned this, a grand engagement hosted by the woman who had stepped into Laura's role without ever earning it. Susan. Perfect, polished, always present at the big events but never there when Ethan had scraped his knees, cried over algebra, or curled into Laura's lap during thunderstorms. No, that had been her. And yet, here was this invitation, as if she were a distant aunt, not the woman who had carried him, birthed him, raised him. Laura walked to the window and stared into the garden. The roses she'd planted 2 decades ago were in full bloom, defiant and red. They bloomed every year, like they remembered. My 7. She almost didn't go. She considered RSVPing no, sending a polite note, maybe even a check in the mail with a carefully worded blessing. But then she remembered Ethan's 8th birthday. The way he'd waited by the window for Richard, holding a baseball glove. He never showed up. And Laura had played catch in the backyard until the sun dipped low and her arm ached. She had always shown up. And she would show up now. Not for Richard. Not for Susan. But for her son. Even if no one saw her anymore. Even if they had done their best to erase her. Laura went upstairs, pulled a dress from the back of her closeta navy blue satin with a simple neckline and soft sleeves. She hadn't worn it in years. She stared at herself in the mirror. Time had written itself across her skin, gentler in some places, harsher in others. But her eyes? They were still the same ones Ethan had looked into when he had nightmares. The same eyes that had watched him walk into kindergarten, then onto the football field, then through every heartbreak he didn't want to admit to. She pinned her hair up slowly and whispered, "You still matter, even if they pretend you don't." My 7. The night of the party, Laura arrived 10 minutes early and sat in her car for another 10. The house Richard's new place was grand, white-lit, brimming with laughter and jazz music. She walked in alone. No one came to greet her. She signed the guest book quietly and made her way through the crowd. Susan was everywhere. Smiling, toasting, introducing herself as Ethan's mom to guests who didn't know better. Laura stood near a floral display and watched. Watched her son laughing with Emily. Watched her ex-husband hold Susan's hand and call her the woman who brought our family together. And no one, not even Ethan, had looked her way. Not yet. But the night wasn't over. And Laura wasn't done being invisible. Not tonight. My 7. The clinking of silverware against fine china echoed through the room, blending with bursts of laughter and the tinkling of champagne glasses. Laura sat at the corner table, tucked beside a marble column and half shielded by an extravagant orchid arrangement. No name card. No seat at the family table. Just an extra chair someone had likely dragged over out of obligation. She took a sip of water flat, warm, and let her eyes scan the crowd. There was Susan again, her blonde hair curled into elegant waves, moving between tables like she was born to host. She was laughing with Emily's parents, shaking hands with distant relatives, posing for photos with Ethan. Her Ethan. Laura had memorized the curve of his cheek, the way his smile slanted slightly more to the left when he was nervous. She remembered the birthmark just below his shoulder blade, the one he used to call his superhero mark. She remembered things Susan would never know. And yet, there she was, sashaying through Laura's memories like she owned them. My 7. Someone tapped a spoon against a champagne flute. The room quieted. Richard stood at the center of it all, looking proud in his tailored tux. He smiled, the kind of smile that once melted Laura's defenses, long before the lies, the distance, and finally the divorce. "Thank you all for being here," he began, voice full of charm and confidence. "Tonight, we celebrate not just the love between Ethan and Emily, but the incredible people who raised them." Laura's breath caught. "Emily's parents have raised a smart, compassionate, beautiful daughter," he continued, gesturing toward them. "And as for Ethan—" He paused, turning toward Susan. "I want to take a moment to thank the woman who truly shaped my son into the man he is today." He reached for Susan's hand. "She's been a constant presence, a guiding light. Susan, you've been more of a mother than anyone could ask for." The room erupted in applause. Glasses lifted. Smiles beamed. Susan dabbed at her eyes, then leaned into Richard's shoulder like the scene was rehearsed. Laura didn't move. She didn't blink. She just sat there still, small and utterly erased. "My 7. Someone at the next table whispered, "Wait, isn't that Ethan's mom over there?" Another voice, muffled but sharp. "I thought Susan raised him? Richard and her have been together forever." Laura stared straight ahead, her hands clenched in her lap. Her fingernails dug into the soft fabric of her dress. She wasn't jealous. This wasn't about vanity. It was about truth. It was about being written out of a story she had helped write page by page, year by year, night after sleepless night. Her son had had 2 fevers so high, he hallucinated she was the one who held his head over a basin while he threw up between sobs. She was the one who taught him to drive, clutching the seat in panic while whispering calm into his panic. She had given him everything. And now? Now she was the woman who used to be. No one had even said her name. Not Ethan. Not Richard. Not Susan. "My 7. Laura stood up. Slowly, quietly. Her napkin slid to the floor, but she didn't pick it up. All around her, the party carried on cheers, music, the buzz of celebration. No one noticed her movement. Not yet. But they would. She stepped out from behind the orchid arrangement, her heels steady despite the trembling in her chest. And just as Richard began raising his glass again to toast the happy couple, Laura spoke. "Excuse me." Her voice was clear, calm, but it carried. The room went still, forks froze mid-air, heads turned. Ethan looked confused. Susan stiffened. Richard's smile vanished. Laura stepped forward. "I'm sorry to interrupt," she said. "I just need to say something before we pretend this evening was complete." Then she reached for the microphone. And no one, no, even Richard dared stop her. "My 7. The microphone felt foreign in her hands leak, cold and far too powerful for someone who had spent a decade whispering herself into corners. Laura could hear her own heartbeat in her ears, steady but insistent, like a drum roll before a moment no one saw coming. Across the room, Susan's hand slowly slipped from Richard's arm. Ethan looked stunned, his mouth parting as if to say something, but he didn't. He didn't move. No one did. And that was when Laura knew. This silence was hers. She had the floor. Her voice was calm when it came, but it didn't tremble. Not this time. "I wasn't going to speak tonight," she began. "In fact, I almost didn't come." She looked around the room, not at her ex-husband, not at Susan, but at the guests. The onlookers. The ones clapping seconds ago, the ones who had smiled at a woman who wasn't the mother. "But something's been missing from this evening," she continued, "and I think I finally understand what it is." She turned to Ethan, his eyes locked onto hers. There was confusion there, but also something else. A flicker of guilt. Maybe memory? I held this boy, Laura said, voice steady, when he had his first nightmare and was too afraid to sleep alone. I was the one who stayed up until 3 a.m. during science fair week, helping him finish a project he forgot until the night before. I held his hand after his first heartbreak, even when he swore he didn't need me. Her lips curled into a small, pained smile. I cried outside the DMV when he passed his driving test. Not because I was proud, though I was, but because I knew the world had just opened up to him, and I'd be watching him drive further and further away from me. A soft gasp came from somewhere in the crowd. Another napkin lifted discreetly to an eye. Laura breathed in, deep, and then sharp. And yet tonight, I sat in a room full of strangers as my son's life was retold without me in it, as if I had been a footnote, or worse, erased. Her gaze moved to Richard. "No one likes a messy story," she said. "It's cleaner to pretend the family you see here was always whole." That Susan stepped in and filled a space that was empty. She turned back to the room. But I was never absent. I was just quiet. And I see now that was my mistake. My 7. The room was stone still. Laura's hand didn't shake. Her voice didn't break. But her heart? It was breaking wide open. "I'm not here to reclaim a spotlight," she said. "I'm not here to embarrass anyone." A pause. "But I won't sit quietly while my love, my sacrifices, and my motherhood are rewritten as a shadow someone else filled." She turned to Susan now calmly, not cruelly. "I'm sure you've been good to him. I don't doubt that, and I've never tried to make things difficult. But raising a child is not the same as arriving after the hardest parts are over." She looked back at Ethan one last time. "And to my son, you may not remember everything I gave, but I remember. And I will no longer allow silence to be the only version of my story." My 7. Then she handed the microphone back. No mic drop. No dramatics. Just a quiet walk back through a sea of stunned silence. The kind of silence that only comes after truth is spoken, and everything has to rearrange itself to make space for it. She didn't wait for applause. She didn't need it. She had already reclaimed what mattered most. My 7. Laura didn't storm out. She walked head high, spine straight through a ballroom filled with stunned silence and half-finished toasts. She passed tables covered in linen and roses, faces frozen mid-sip, eyes wide with the kind of shock reserved for moments that split time. She reached the exit before she realized her hands were clenched. Not in rage. In release? As if something she'd carried for years had finally slipped out of her fingers and shattered on the polished floor behind her. She stepped into the night air. It was cooler than she expected, brushing her skin like a secret. She didn't cry. Not yet. She just kept walking, heels echoing across the stone patio until she reached the edge where a low wall met a row of string lights glowing like quiet fireflies. And then she heard it. "Mom, wait." She stopped. 2 words she hadn't heard in months. And never quite like this. She turned. Ethan was breathless, jacket slightly askew, eyes wild with something that looked dangerously close to shame. "Mom," he said again, "can we talk?" Laura looked at her son, her little boy who once fell asleep with his hand wrapped around hers. The man who had just let a room full of people believe she didn't exist. She didn't speak. Didn't know Dad was going to say that," Ethan began. "About Susan. I swear, that speech, it wasn't planned." Laura raised an eyebrow. "Wasn't it?" His face flushed. "Okay, maybe it was. I mean, I knew he'd thank her, but I didn't think he'd erase you." He said the word like it burned. Laura leaned against the wall, arms crossed. "Do you remember your 5th-grade history project?" she asked softly. Ethan blinked. "What?" "You wanted to build a cardboard model of the Lincoln Memorial. You cried because the columns kept falling over." A pause. "I remember that. I stayed up with you until midnight, We used paper towel rolls. I cut 26 of them by hand. A pause. You won first place. Ethan's shoulders sank. I'm not telling you this to guilt you, Laura continued. I'm telling you this because you forget. And when you forget, it leaves space for someone else to rewrite what happened. I didn't mean to. I know. She looked away. But you didn't stop it either. My 6. They stood in silence, the party lights flickering behind the windows like a distant world. I never wanted you to choose between us, Laura said after a moment. That's why I stayed quiet, why I let Susan take the spotlight. But I shouldn't have. Ethan swallowed hard. You were never invisible to me. She looked at him. Then why didn't you look at me once during that speech? That landed. He didn't have an answer. Laura stepped forward, reached up, and gently touched his face. My love for you doesn't need recognition to exist. But I deserve more than a shadow. I know, Ethan said, his voice breaking. I'm so sorry. I don't want your apology, Ethan. I want your awareness. She smiled, softly. I want you to know I was there. My 6. Inside the house, the music started again, soft jazz floating out like nothing had happened. Susan didn't come after them. Richard didn't either. Maybe that said enough. Ethan took a deep breath. Are you leaving? Laura nodded. You're not staying for dessert? She laughed gently. Sweetheart, I already had my moment. He looked down. Laura leaned in and whispered, You get to decide what kind of man you become from this moment forward, not based on tonight, but based on how you choose to carry the truth. Ethan nodded, eyes wet. Laura turned, walked down the steps, heels clicking gently into the night. This time, she didn't walk away with bitterness. She walked away with her name back, with her motherhood intact, and with a piece of her finally restored. My 7. A week passed. Laura didn't expect a thing. No text. No call. No word from Richard. Of course, no even a weak attempt at damage control. And from Susan? Silence, wrapped in self-righteousness. She had made peace with that. But on Saturday morning, there it was. A white envelope slipped through the front door. Her name handwritten across the front. Mom! She held it for a moment, stunned, then slowly opened it at the kitchen table, sunlight pouring across the faded wood. In Sedeno greeting card. Just a single page and Ethan's familiar handwriting. Mom, I don't know where to start. But I know I have to start somewhere. I've replayed that night in my head 100 times, and it's not just what Dad said. It's that I let it happen. That I stood there while someone else got credit for your sacrifices without even blinking. And it wasn't just that night. It's been building for years. Somewhere along the way, I let people reframe my story. Our story. And in doing that, I erased you without even realizing it. You didn't deserve that. You were the one who packed my lunches with handwritten notes. You were the one who held my hand when I couldn't breathe before my first college exam. You were the one who sat with me through fevers, heartbreaks, and self-doubt. You were never invisible. I just stopped looking. I don't expect forgiveness. I'm not writing this to earn something back. I'm writing because I want you to know I see you now. And I want to do better. Emily and I have talked a lot about what happened. She asked why I never told her more about you. And honestly, I didn't have a good answer. But I do now. So here's what I'm asking, if you're open to it. I want us to start something together, something real. A project, maybe, to give women like you a voice. The ones who gave everything and were told they were just someone's support. The ones who stayed invisible for too long. You changed the way I see everything. And I think you can change the way the world sees women like you, too. Love? Ethan. Laura stared at the letter for a long time. Longer than she expected. It wasn't perfect. It wasn't a cure. But it was a beginning. The kind of beginning that doesn't arrive with balloons or flowers. But with truth. And for the first time in years, She felt the world shift just slightly. Toward her? Not around her. Not away from her. Toward her. She stood up, walked to the window, and whispered, "I'm not erased. Not anymore." The library was quiet, except for the soft scratch of Laura's pen against the edge of her notebook and the faint hum of an old ceiling fan. Sunlight streamed through tall windows, casting a warm glow across the long wooden table where she and Ethan sat mother and son, side by side, surrounded by stories waiting to be told. They had rented the small community room every Saturday for the past month. It started with just them, Ethan with his laptop, Laura with a stack of yellowing journals and scribbled memories. But now there were more. 4 women had joined last week. All older. All with stories they thought no one wanted to hear. Until they heard Laura's. It had begun as an Idean oral history project. A small digital archive for women over 50 who had felt invisible, forgotten, rewritten in the shadows of others' achievements. But it was quickly becoming something more. Ethan looked up from the screen. "Mom, read this." He turned his laptop to face her. On it, a draft title, "Unseen Until Now: Stories of the Invisible Women Who Raised Us." Laura stared at it, breath catching in her chest. She didn't speak. She just nodded, slowly, until her hand found his and squeezed. Later that day, they held their first group session in the little auditorium above the library. 12 women showed up. Some had stories about husbands, others about children, a few about employers, systems, entire communities that made them feel like wallpaper. Laura stood in front, microphone trembling slightly in her hand. "I'm not a speaker," she began, and a few chuckled. "But I am a woman who lived too many years in the background, and I'm done with that now." She paused, looked out into the sea of expectant faces. "There was a moment recently at a party meant to celebrate my son where I was called no one. And in that moment, something inside me stood up, even before my body did. That voice that had been waiting for decades finally said, 'Enough.'" She glanced at Ethan in the front row. He gave her the smallest nod, the same way he did when he was 6 and wanted her to stay just one more minute beside his bed. "I thought speaking up would feel like breaking something, but instead, it felt like finally building something of my own." She told them everything. Not just the speech, but the years of shrinking herself, the decades of holding a family together without recognition, the ache of watching someone else receive applause for a life she had built brick by brick. And when she finished, no one clapped at first. They just stood, every one of them, until the whole room was on their feet clapping, not for performance, but for reclamation. The next week, local news picked up the project. Then a podcast, then a publisher reached out. Soon, Laura's email was flooded with messages from women across the country. "I thought I was the only one. Your story gave me the courage to tell mine. My daughter listened to me for the first time in years." One night, as Laura scrolled through the inbox with a mug of tea in hand, a single message made her eyes sting with quiet disbelief. It was from Susan. Just one sentence. "I'm sorry I let him erase you." Laura stared at it for a long time, then closed her laptop. She didn't need more than that. Not anymore. Weeks later, at a small bookstore event in their hometown, Ethan introduced her before the reading. He looked out at the crowd and said, "This is the woman who held me up before I knew how to stand. And now, she's helping other women stand beside her." Laura took the stage. She didn't wear anything flashy, no rehearsed jokes, no grand gestures. Just her truth. And when she opened her book, titled simply, "The Mother You Forgot," she smiled, took a breath, and began. "I was the one holding his hand during his first heartbreak, and I will never apologize for remembering that even when the world tried to forget." The room went silent. And this time, the silence wasn't empty. It was reverent. It was hers. She had walked out, once, but now she stood tall. Not as someone's ex, not as the forgotten guest, but as a woman who had finally, fully, been seen. My 7. The first time a stranger called her by name, not Ethan's mom, not Richard's ex, was in a podcast interview 6 weeks after her book launched. Laura Bennett, the host said, smiling through the mic. Thank you for being with us. Your book is shaking people to their core. Laura blinked. It was such a simple thing, hearing her name. But it landed in her chest like an anchor dropping into still water, steadying her. I'm honored to be here, she said softly, her voice no longer trembling. And I'm not the only one with a story like this. That's what matters most. After the episode aired, the messages poured in again, only this time from daughters. Young women in their 20s, mothers in their 40s, grandmothers in their 70s. My mom cried listening to your interview. I never realized I'd become the kind of woman who didn't see my own mother. Your words made me call her today for the first time in months. Laura read each one, tears slipping down quietly as she sat on her back porch in the evening breeze. She was building something she hadn't expected. Not just a moment of revenge or reckoning. A movement. My 7. That weekend, she attended a small gathering hosted by one of the women from the project. It was in someone's backyard, under soft string lights and a sky that still held the golden warmth of early spring. Dozens of women stood in a circle, sharing snapshots of their pasts, what they gave up, what they buried, what they survived in silence. Then one woman, Miriam, 72, stood up with her cane, voice shaking. I was married for 48 years, she said. Raised 4 kids, worked nights, cooked every meal. At my husband's funeral, one of his colleagues said, I didn't even know he was married. She looked around, eyes glossy, but defiant. Never again. I will be seen before I leave this world. The circle erupted in soft clapping and tearful smiles. Laura hugged Miriam tightly afterward. I see you, she whispered. I know, Miriam replied, because you let us see you first. My 7. Ethan called that night. His voice held that gentle tiredness Laura remembered from his childhood when he stayed up too late studying or worrying. Mom, he said, I met a woman at work today. She asked if I was the Ethan from The Mother You Forgot. Laura laughed, genuinely from her belly. You're famous now. No, you are, he said. A pause. I'm proud of you. Laura was quiet for a moment. Then she said, That means more than you know. Ethan hesitated. There's something else? I know your birthday's next week. Emily and I were talking, and if you're open to it, we'd like to host a little celebration. At our place. Just family and some of the women from the project. Laura's breath caught. Her birthday had come and gone quietly for the last decade. Usually just a card from a neighbor or a solo dinner she pretended to enjoy. Now this? I'd love that, she said, her voice warm. We'll do it right this time, Ethan added. Your story, your name, your seat at the table. Laura hung up and sat in the quiet. She didn't need the celebration. She didn't need the book sales, or the podcasts, or the emails. But knowing her son finally saw her truly, finally saw her, that was the beginning of a peace she had never thought she'd live to feel. The kind that comes not from being the center of someone's world, but from finally returning to the center of your own. My 7. The living room was filled with laughter and light. Candles flickered on the sideboard, and a soft playlist hummed in the background, old jazz, the kind Laura used to play on Sunday mornings while cleaning with a cup of strong coffee and quiet satisfaction. Emily had transformed their modest home into something elegant but intimate. String lights. Photos of Laura through the years, real ones, not just snapshots of her beside Ethan, but of her. Her reading to a group of children. Her hiking solo in the Rockies when she turned 50. Her standing in front of the microphone at her very first book launch. And there, on a table by the cake, a framed quote from her book. Being a mother is not a supporting role, it's the whole damn foundation. Laura walked in slowly, greeted by a round of soft applause and wide, welcoming smiles. Her knees trembled slightly, not from nerves, but from awe. She hadn't been the guest of honor in decades. A woman from the project came forward with flowers. Another handed her a homemade card signed by 15 women who had once been invisible and now called themselves the Unforgettables. And Ethan? He stood near the center, watching her the way you look at a constellation for the first time after learning its name. "Everyone," he said, clinking his glass, "if I could have your attention for just a minute." The room fell quiet. "My mother," he began, voice steady, "is someone I once let slip into the background. Not because she wasn't extraordinary, but because I didn't realize I was standing on the shoulders of her strength." He turned to Laura. "You didn't just raise me, Mom, you built me. With sacrifice, with silence, and later with a voice so powerful it shook something loose in me." He took a breath. "So tonight, we celebrate your birthday, and the fact that the world finally caught up to what I've come to know. You're unforgettable." Laura's eyes stung. Someone handed her a glass of champagne, and the crowd nudged her gently toward the front. She stood in the light, no microphone this time, just her voice, and smiled. "Thank you," she began, "not just for being here, but for seeing me." She let her eyes drift to the women she'd come to know through the project. "This isn't just my story, it's ours." A pause. "I once stood at an engagement party where my name wasn't spoken, where another woman was called the real mother, and I believed, in that moment, that my years of love and labor had been erased." She let the silence land. "But here's the thing. You cannot erase a woman who remembers herself. You cannot replace a mother whose love is woven into someone's bones." Applause rose, gentle, reverent. Laura blinked back tears. "I walked out that night. But what I walked into was so much greater. I walked into a version of myself I'd been waiting to become." And just then, the door opened. Heads turned. The room quieted again. Richard stood there, awkward in the doorway, holding a small gift bag and an expression that was equal parts guilt, pride, and exhaustion. "To hope I'm not interrupting," he said. Ethan stepped forward, unsure. "Dad?" "I heard about the book," Richard said quietly. "I read it, all of it." Laura didn't speak. She watched. Richard approached slowly, then stopped a few feet from her. "I didn't realize how much I'd rewritten," he admitted. "How much of the truth I blurred out because it made me uncomfortable, because it meant I'd have to admit I didn't deserve the loyalty you gave." He handed her the gift bag. Inside, a photo, framed. It was the three of them: Laura, Ethan, and a toddler Emily had never met at the beach. Laura was holding Ethan, wind in her hair, joy radiating from her face. Richard cleared his throat. "I kept it in my drawer all these years. I think maybe I kept it hidden, because I knew you were the best of us." Laura said nothing for a moment. Then she reached out, took the photo gently, and whispered, "I know." She didn't need revenge. She didn't need applause. She had her name back. She had her son. She had a legacy. As the evening wore on, someone lit the birthday candles, and the entire room sang to her, not like she was a footnote or a +1, but like she was the center of the story. When she closed her eyes to blow out the flames, Laura didn't wish to be seen. She already was. And this time, she wasn't going anywhere. My 7. If you've ever sat quietly at a table where your name was never spoken, if you've ever watched someone else take credit for a life you poured yourself into, this story is your reminder. You were never invisible. You were just waiting for the moment to rise. Share your thoughts in the comments. Subscribe to Revenge with Emma for more true-to-life stories about women reclaiming their power. If this story moved you, comment 2 or type, "I see her." Because women like Laura, they deserve to be seen and remembered.